Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Before I begin, I'd like to offer a simple reminder. I'm not above making mistakes, and I always encourage you to study and test everything for yourself. With that out of the way, let's dive into this week's Parsha. This week, our Torah portion is Tzav and HaGadol, which can be translated as command and the Great Sabbath. This can be found in Leviticus 6, 8 through 8:36. Our Haftarah portion is in Micah 3:4 through 4:6. Our Brit Chadashah portion is Matthew 17, 9 through 13. And our psalm is 107, 17 through 30. There's always a certain atmosphere that settles over us in this pre-Passover season. Some of you have felt it for years. Others may only be noticing it now. Some of you can look back on your life and even see in seasons when you weren't walking this path. Even then, you knew that there was a rhythm to Torah. You might have realized that this time of year was always rough, always heavy, always strangely pressing. It's not always loud or dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or warnings. It's quieter than that, almost like pressure in the air. A kind of spiritual heaviness that rests on the edges of our days. Little things begin to go wrong. Our old frustration resurfaces. Emotions sit closer to the surface. Weariness creeps in even when you're doing everything right. It's not just one or two of us, it's something many of us have felt. A shared experience woven into this time of year. The closer we get to Passover, the more the weight of the season presses on us. Not to crush us, but to prepare us. To make us aware of something that is sacred is drawing near. And I've come to realize this isn't an individual failure. It's not a sign that we're doing something wrong. It's actually a pattern, a spiritual rhythm built into this season. Before the covenantal renewal, there's always resistance. Before freedom, there's always pressure. Before a breakthrough, there's always testing. Even the sages hint at this in Pesachim 1:1, where the search for Hametz begins at the light of the 14th, a phrase that rabbis interpret as the time of careful attention, heightened awareness. The Midrash assumes that the days leading up to Passover require a different posture, a more intentional, more spiritual alert of the ways moving through the world. Passover is a threshold moment, a doorway between what was and what will be, a moment where God invites us to step out of old identities and into a renewed covenant. And standing at the threshold always brings a certain weight to it. And thinking about the threshold, this sense of standing between a season, between stories, between identities, made me think of an old parable that I heard once, something ancient, something that stood through generations, something that knows what it means to bear the weight of people preparing for covenant renewal. The ancient doorframe speaks. I have stood longer than memory, longer than family who has passed beneath my lintel. I have watched generations rise and fall, and I've held this threshold through seasons of joys and seasons of sorrow. I have felt the desert winds carve their stories into my grain. I have endured storms, heat, cold, and long silence of waiting. But every year, as the month of Nisan approaches, I feel the pressure return, the house stirring, the people growing restless. The air thickens with testing. I hear the sighs, the arguments, the weariness. I have felt the hands that lean on me when strength runs thin. I bear the weight of their burdens as they prepare. And I wonder, will they remember? Will they recall who they are? Will they remember why I was placed here? The night comes, the night that shapes a nation, a night that marked me forever. Once again, the covenant touches me. The blood, the ancient, sacred sealing rests upon me, and I remember. I remember the cries for freedom. I remember the promises spoken in darkness. I remember God who passed over and preserved. And in that moment, I stand renewed. Not because I am strong, but because the covenant is. Renewal doesn't come at the beginning. Renewal doesn't wait for the end. Renewal comes here in the middle. The people are weary. The journey feels long when the testing presses hardest. I have learned this truth through ages. The identity is restored when the covenant is remembered. And so I stand, ancient and steady. and the whisper of every soul who passes beneath me. You are still his. You are still marked. You are still part of the story. And even when you feel like dry bones, the one who breathes life into Israel will breathe life into you again. When the doorframe voices fades, we're left with the quiet truth echoing the room. Renewal comes in the middle. When we are tired, when the journey feels long, the pressure is the greatest. And that truth doesn't belong to just a parable. It belongs to our story as people. Because Israel knew this place well, they knew that it was to stand in the middle of the wilderness, worn down, uncertain, and carrying the weight of their own failures and fears. And right here, in the middle of the place, that God meets them again. It's not rejection, but a renewal covenant. Not with distance, but with presence. And just as the doorframe was the threshold of a home, a place where a covenant touches Israel's family, the altar, too, is the threshold of a nation. The outer altar in the tabernacle and the temple, in many ways, was Israel's national doorway. It was a place where blood marked identity and offerings rose like prayers. And the people crossed from guilt into forgiveness, from distance to nearness, and from wandering to belonging. The Mishna even hints at this when it says, the altar sanctifies whatever it touches. Mishna Zevachim 9:7. Now the blood that sanctifies the doorframe, the altar that sanctifies the nation. The doorframe carries the covenant of a household. The altar carries the covenant for a people. And both stood as thresholds, a place where God met his people in the middle of their story. And that's the beginning of another memory. The doorframe carries a memory woven into the very night that it was marked. Should be the other word. That's okay. Before we move on, the doorframe also reminds us something else. The night of the 10 plagues ended, not as a moment of triumph, but as a moment of mercy. And before we step into the weight of that night, I want to take a brief moment of levity. Because sometimes before we face something heavy, it helps to breathe. Sometimes laughter opens our heart so truth can settle more deeply. And sometimes humor reminds us that we survive something overwhelming. So before we continue, let's watch a short Robert Williams Passover bit together. It's less than 2 minutes, but it captures something real about the chaos, the drama, and the holy absurdity of this story. Do you mind, Bo? Thank you, sir.
I'm talking about the time Moses said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh went, "In your dreams." And Moses called to God, going, "God, I need some help." And frogs fell from the sky. Maybe they fell from the sky, or maybe they were Jews with catapults going, "Now!" And thank God it was the Egyptians and not the French, because the French would go, "Lunch, okay? Why should we let you go? You're great caterers. I can't let you go, you crazy people, huh?" But frogs fell from the sky. But that's what they dropped in. And even then, Pharaoh was not pleased. He said, "Oh, please, David Copperfield, no." And then boils, and then firstborn dies. That's it! Hebrews, get out! And everybody, Banish Taranoi, everybody! Hello, let's not wait for the bread to rise. Let's take the crackers. We're going through the desert, and then they get the 10 Commandments, would be adjusted by certain presidents. That happens later. And they get to the Red Sea there, the sea. And they go, "What now, Mr. Magic? What do we do now?" And he calls to God again, and the sea parts. And even the most doubting Jew is going, "You're good." Let's go, everybody. Come on, everybody. Let's move. Don't eat the shellfish. I'll tell you why later. Let's go. And then the Pharaoh comes, but the sea closes, and he calls to his cat-like God, but his cat-like God's afraid of water. And people say to me, they say, Jesus wasn't Jewish. I say, of course he was Jewish. 30 years old, single, living at home with his parents. Come on. Working in his father's business, his mother thought he was God's gift. He's Jewish. Give it up. It's an old tradition. And if he was Jewish, and many of his disciples were Jewish, for the Last Supper, would they not have gone out for Chinese? I think so.
Thank you. Now that we have all laughed, let's step back into the story that the laughter is pointing to. Because the plagues were not comedy, they were a confrontation. God was dismantling everything that claimed ownership over his people. And the doorframe remembers each one. Every year at the Seder, we remember them too. We speak of each plague aloud, and we drop of wine on each one, because even righteous judgment reduces our joy. Redemption comes through suffering, and we honor that truth. The blood. Dam. Exodus 7:20 through 21. All the water of the Nile turned into blood, and the fish of the Nile died. The Nile was Egypt's pride, its economy, its identity, and its lifeline. God struck the very thing Egypt trusted most. A way we can apply this to modern times, sometimes God allows things that we rely on our routines, our stability, our Nile, to be disrupted so that we remember who truly sustains us. Mishna Avot 3:1. Know from where you came and from where you are going. Egypt forgot, God remembers them. When we say the dam or the blood, when we remove a drop of wine, because every necessity judgment costs something. The frogs. Frogs invaded every space, beds, ovens, and kneading bowls. God showed that no boundaries could keep him out. Psalm 74:45. He sent frogs which destroyed them. How can we apply this to today? Sometimes the things that we're trying to keep outside, stress, fear, unresolved issues, hop right into the middle of our lives until we face them. When we say frogs at the Seder, we remember that sometimes the things that overwhelm us are the things we never saw coming. Lice, ketem. Exodus 8:9. This is the finger of God. Dust became lice. The very ground beneath their feet turned against them. Our modern connection, this is the plague of small things. Tiny irritations, 1,000 paper cuts. The things that shouldn't matter but somehow break us. For many of us, this fills the pre-Passover season. For the Seder, when we say kedem, lice, we acknowledge that even the smallest irritations can wear us down, the human spirit. The wild beast, Arov. Arov is the most debated plague because Hebrew word for Arov doesn't name a specific creature. It literally means a mixture. A mixture of what? Tradition varies. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Torah, renders Avot as dog flies, a kind of biting, blood-seeking fly. That is why many Bible translations say flies. But the Hebrew doesn't say flies. It says mixture. Rabbinic tradition such as Rashi teaches that Arov, the wild beast, was a mixture of wild beasts, lions, wolves, bears, leopards, creatures that do not belong in homes. This plague was not one creature, but many, breaking boundaries all at once. Aron, the wild beast, is a plague of invasion, when the outside world breaks in. How might we look at this in a modern world? The plague of intrusion, when things we didn't invite into our lives, anxiety, conflict, unexpected crises, spiritual pressure, emotional overwhelming. The wild beast is a moment when the boundaries we depended on felt porous, and everything seemed to come at us all at once. Mishnah Avot 2:6. In a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. When the world around us breaks down, we must stand firm. When we say Arov, the wild beast, and drop wine into the plate, we acknowledge that the intrusion that have entered our own lives, the things that bargain without permission. The wild beasts remind us that even the world breaks in. God guards what is his. The pestilence, dever. The livestock died, the economy collapsed. This is a plague of loss, financial and emotional and relationship. The moment for what we built seems to crumble. Psalms 34:19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of all. The Seder connection. When we say dever, we remember the lost part of the story. But so is deliverance. The boils, the shakim. Pain touches everybody. How might this be applied to our modern society? This is the plague of personal suffering, the moment when the battle becomes physical, emotional, or mental. Psalm 107, 19 through 20. Then they cried out to Adonai in their trouble, and he sent his word and healed them. The Seder, when we say Shechem, the boils, we acknowledge that pain touches every family, every generation, and yet God still heals. The hail, the babard, the fire and ice fell together, a miracle of opposites. What might a modern connection look like this today? This is a plague of contradictions when life feels like fire and ice at the same time, emotional clash. The circumstance pulls us into the opposite directions. Exodus, Rabbah 12:4, the fire and ice made peace to obey God. Even the creation submitted to his will. When we say barad, the hail, we remember that God can bring order out of the contradictions and peace out of conflict. The locust, the arbed, what was left, the locust devoured. How might we see this in our own lives today? This is a plague of depletion, when we feel that we have nothing left to give. Isaiah 40:29. He gives power to the faint, and to him he has no might. He increases strength. So in the Seder, when we say abar, locust, we acknowledge the season when everything feels consumed, and we remember that God who restores what was eaten. Darkness, kodashim, a darkness that could be felt. How might we see this here today? A plague of emotional heaviness, depression, despair, numbness, a spiritual fog. Psalms 139:12, even the darkness is not dark to you. Darkness blinds us, but it does not blind God. Darkness isolates us, but it cannot isolate us from him. Darkness confuses us, but it does not confuse the one who sees all. So when we're at the Seder and we say Kadesh, the darkness, we remember that Israel had light in their dwellings, and sometimes God doesn't remove the darkness, but he gives light from within. The death of the firstborn. Market Bakot, the final blow, the night when judgment passed over, and mercy stood guard at every marked door. What might we see this in a modern day? This is the plague of endings, the death of old identities, old patterns, old chains. God is not destroying Israel. He is breaking the final chain that held them captive. Deliverance always costs something, but bondage costs far more. So when we're at the Seder and we say Market Barkot, the death of the firstborn, we remember the weight of redemption and the mercy that stood guard at every marked door. The plagues were not random punishment. They were God dismantling every false identity, every false god, every false claim over his people. And with Egypt's powers broken, God led his people towards a new kind of fire, a fire not of judgment, but of covenant. That brings us to the fire of Tzav. When we step into this week's Torah portion, Tzav, we find a theme that speaks directly to everything we've been feeling this season. Leviticus 6 through 8 doesn't give us a dramatic miracles or sweeping narratives. Instead, it gives us something quieter, something steady, something that happens not at the beginning or at the end, but right in the middle of the journey. It speaks of fire, a fire that must never go out. Every morning, the priests are commanded to tend the altar, adding wood, arranging the offerings, and removing the ash that had built up from the day before. It's slow but faithful work. It's not glamorous, it's not loud, it's not miraculous, but it's essential, because if the ash is not removed, the fire suffocates. If the fire is not tended, the flame dies. If the flame dies, the offerings cannot rise. And if the offerings cannot rise, the covenant cannot be lived out. But Tzav gives us more than instructions. It gives us imagery. Mishna, Tamid 2:2 tells us that on the altar, the priest would gather the ashes for the mound of the tupah, translated as the apple. This would be seen during great festivals. During the festivals, when the mount grew large, a visible reminder that Israel has been faithful in their offerings. The ashes were not wasted. It was a memory. It was evidence. It was a story of every offering that had risen before God. Even the tupah, the apple, had to be managed. The ash had to be removed daily so that the fire could breathe again. Tzav teaches us, you honor the past, but you don't let yesterday's ash smother today's fire. Tzav also reminds us that not all fire is holy fire. Later in Leviticus, during the Parsha Shemini, Nadab and Abihu bring strange fire. fire not taken from the altar that God himself had lit, and they were consumed. Leviticus 10, 1-2. Why? Because holy work must be fueled by holy fire. Tzav teaches us you cannot sustain your calling with someone else's flame. You cannot live your covenant on borrowed fire. You cannot substitute God's fire with your own spark. The fire on the altar was lit by God, Leviticus 9:24. The priest's job was not to create fire, but to tend to the fire that God had already given. The heart of Tzav, God provides the flame. We provide the faithfulness. The priests are set apart, and we see something else. The consecration of Aaron and his sons. They are washed, clothed, anointed, and set apart. Not at the beginning of Israel's story, not at the end, but right here in the middle of the wilderness. The identity of renewal in the middle of the journey. Mishna Zevachim 2:1 teaches that the priests were not fully priest until he had been washed, clothed, anointed, and placed into service. The identity is not just declared, it is emboldened. Tzav teaches us God renews the identity when everything is perfect, but when everything is dusty, weary, and halfway. Where we find ourselves. This isn't exactly where many of us find ourselves this week. Not at the beginning of our spiritual journey, full of excitement. Not at the end, standing in victory, but somewhere in the middle, tired, stretched, carrying the ashes of the past year, wondering if the flame is still burning. Tzav tells us the fire is still here. It only needs tending. It only needs to breathe. Just as the door frame remembered who it was when the covenant touched it again, the altar remembers who it was when the fire is tended again. The priest removed the ashes, not the shame of the past, but to make room for the flame to rise. The covenant of renewal is in the middle. The identity is restored in the middle. God is meeting his people in the quiet, steady work of tending the flame. And it prepares us for what comes next. When we look at the commands in Tzav, it's not hard to see ourselves because we are all in the middle of a journey season. Times when the fire inside us feels dim, when the ashes have built up from the wear and tear of life, when we feel scattered, tired, or spiritually thin. There are moments when we feel like the altar is still marked by the covenant and still belongs to God, but weighed down by the layer of ash. Moments when we wonder if the flame is still burning. Moments when we ask if God is still with us in some way. Moments when the quiet question whether we still belong in the story he's writing. And yet, in those very moments, in the middle place, God draws near. Not when we feel strong, but when we're worn down. Not when everything is going right, but when everything seems fragile. Not when we're standing on mountaintops, but when we're standing in the wilderness, unsure of our next step. This is the God who spoke to Elijah, not in wind, not in earthquake, not in fire, but in a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. A whisper that said, I am still with you. A whisper that cuts through noise. A whisper that reaches us when we are too tired to reach back. And for many of us, this pre-Passover season brings us into sharp focus, because this is the time of year when the pressure rises, when the spiritual atmosphere tightens, and the smallest thing can feel like the whole world is crashing down. Whether it's a text message, a misunderstanding, a moment of exhaustion, a task that should be simple, but suddenly feels impossible. It's the season when the ash builds up faster than we can clear it, and yet this is also the season we find ourselves relying on the Lord more deeply than we expected, when we discover our strength was never fueled by fuel for the flame, when we learn again that the fire on the altar was God's fire, not ours. This past week in Midrash, Bo talked about the acronym FAT, focus, attention, and time. These are three things that shape what we can bring here and now as our offerings to the Lord. Isn't this what exactly Leviticus is teaching? Focus. Where's your gaze? Are you focusing on him or on the worries of this world? Attention. What are you giving your energy to? What occupies your inner space of your heart? Time. How are you using your hours for God? How are you using the hours God has given you? What are you tending? The flame God gave you, or the things that smother it? Something we hear all the time, and I'm guilty of this too, is I just don't have enough time for this. Or I'm so busy I can't read my Bible, or fill in the blank. But we all know the saying, and we all know that it's true. You make time for what is important to you. Because in the middle, where the covenant is renewed, The middle is where identity is restored. The middle is where God whispers, I am still with you. And in the middle is where we learn to tend the flame again, not with our own strength, but with his breath. This is a covenant renewal in the middle. The identity is restored in the middle. This is God meeting his people in the quiet, steady work of tending the flame. And it prepares us perfectly for what comes next. There's something else that happens in the season, something quieter, something inside of us. If the doorframe is a sign of the outer covenant, the ember is the inner life of it. And over the course of a year, the ember can grow dim. It doesn't go out all at once. It fades slowly, almost unnoticed. A little disappointment there, a little distraction here, a little spiritual pressure from the edges. Ashes settle over it, the ash of busyness, fatigue, discouragement, and the simple wear and tears of life. And right before Passover, this pressure can feel its greatest. The ember can feel almost gone. Just a faint glow under the ash, just enough heat to say, I'm still alive, but not enough to feel like a flame. But an ember doesn't need much. It doesn't need a roaring fire. It doesn't need perfect condition. It just needs one thing, breath. One breath is enough to wake it up. One breath is enough to stir the heat. One breath is enough to turn the fading ember into a live flame again. And that is what God does in the season. He breathes. Just as he breathed life into the dry bones in Ezekiel's vision, prophesying to the breath, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet on an exceedingly great army. Ezekiel 37, 9 through 10. As a reminder of what his breath can do, he breathes into us again. And this breath does not just touch the outer altars of our lives. It reaches the inner altar, the golden altar of incense, the place the scripture calls the most holy of the Lord, Exodus 30:10. The outer altar carries the offering. The inner altar carries fragrance. The outer altar was public. The inner altar was intimate. Mishna Tamid 6:3 teaches the incense of the inner altar had to be tended every single day, morning and evening, a quiet and faithful rhythm that kept the sanctuary filled with fragrance. So is it with us, the ember in the inner altar of our hearts, the place where prayers rise like incense, Psalms 141:2. The place where God renews the right spirit within us, Psalms 51:10. The place where he restores our soul, Psalms 23:3. The place where he breathes life into what has grown weary. The ember of the inner life. The doorframe is the outer sign. One shows who we are on the outside. The other shows what happens on the inside. Both are renewed by the same breath of God. In our Haftarah, the refining fire, the returning of hearts, and the renewal in the middle. When we turn to the Haftarah for Shabbat HaGadol, Micah 3 and 4, we hear a voice calling Israel back to the covenant of faithfulness. An imagery God chooses to strike is strikingly familiar to everything we've been talking about. He speaks of fire, not a destructive fire, but a refining one. He is like a refining fire and like fuller's soap, Micah 3:2. The fire that purifies silver, a fire that restores what has been dulled, a fire that burns away what does not belong, so that what does not belong can shine again. This is the same fire we saw in our Torah portion, the fire that must never go out. The same fire as the ember in our hearts, the same fire God tends in the middle of the journey. Micah tells us he sits as a refiner and the purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, Micah 3:3. He sits because refining takes time, patience, and presence, not to shame us, his people, not to condemn them, but to restore them. As the Mishna echoes in Mishna Avot 8:3, the sages teaches that God's refining is always for the sake of mercy, not destruction, that his judgment is meant to purify, not to annihilate. This is covenant renewal. Then Micah speaks of Elijah, the prophet who comes before the great and awesome day of the Lord. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, with a great and awesome day of the Lord comes, Micah 4:5. What is Elijah's mission? Not spectacle, not thunder, not signs, but hearts. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, Micah 4:6. Elijah's work is relational, restorative. covenantal. He turns hearts back to one another. He turns hearts back to God. He turns a scattered people into a reconciled people. And the ethics of our fathers, Avot 3:17 reminds us, when there is no Torah and there is no proper conduct, where there is no proper conduct, there is no Torah. Micah is calling Israel back to both covenantal truth and covenantal relationship. Elijah's seat at the Seder, the cycle of redemption. And this is why at every Passover Seder we set a place for Elijah. A full seat, a full cup, a full invitation. Not because we are confused about who came before Yeshua. Yeshua himself tells us that John the Baptist came in spirit and the power of Elijah, preparing the way for Messiah's first coming. But Scripture, prophecy often moves in cycles. Redemption comes in cycle. Exile and return comes in cycles. Refining and renewal comes in cycles. Elijah's role is no different. The turning of hearts and preparing the way also comes in cycles. So when we open the door for Elijah at the Seder, we're not denying that John the Baptist fulfilled Malachi's words before Yeshua came. We acknowledge that God continues to send Elijah moments. Voices that call us back. Voices that turn hearts. Voices that prepare us for what God is about to do next. The sages teaches us in Pesachim 10:6 that Elijah came to resolve doubts, restore unity, and to prepare Israel for redemption. And in every generation, we need that to work again. In every generation, God raises up voices that echo Elijah. Every generation, hearts must be turned again. So Elijah's seat is not about waiting for someone we've missed. It's about welcoming the next cycle of renewal and the next turning of hearts. The next preparation for redemption. It's a seat of hope, a seat of anticipation, a seat that says, God is not done turning hearts. God is not done preparing his people. God is not done redeeming. And this is the beginning of the moment where Yeshua himself confirms everything Micah promised. In our Brit Chadashah, Matthew 17:9-13. After Malachi's refining fire and Elijah's turning of the hearts, we come to the Brit Chadashah reading. The story picks up in a place that we feel very familiar, the middle. Yeshua and his disciples were walking down the mountain after the transfiguration. They've seen glory, but they don't yet understand it. They have heard the voice of God, but yet they don't know what it means. They're overwhelmed, confused, and unsure of where they stand in this story. They are, once again, in the middle. In that middle place, they ask Yeshua about Elijah. Then why do the scribes say Elijah must come first? Matthew 17:10. Are they trying to make sense of the timeline? They're trying to understand the cycles of prophecies. They're trying to locate themselves in this unfolding plan of redemption. Yeshua answers them, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him. Matthew 17:12. Matthew adds that the disciples understood that he was speaking of John the Baptist in Matthew 17:13. In other words, God has already begun the work of restoration. The covenant is already being renewed. The hearts are already being turned. The story is already moving forward, even if we don't fully see it yet. This is exactly what Malachi promises and exactly what Yeshua confirms. Just as we said before, prophecy moves often in cycles. Elijah came in the day of Ahab. Elijah came again in the spirit and the power of John the Baptist. In Elijah's work, the turning of hearts continues in every generation. Mishna Sanhedrin 90a teaches that the righteous are raised in their time, and the sages interpret this to mean that God brings renewals in cycles, and each one is preparing the way for the next. So Yeshua says Elijah has already come. He's not closing the story, he's revealing that the cycle has just begun again. John the Baptist was Elijah who prepared the way for Messiah's first coming. And the work of Elijah, the turning of hearts, continues until Messiah returns. This matches perfectly with the seat we set for Elijah at the Seder. Not because we've missed him, but because God continues to send Elijah moments in every generation, in every cycle, in every middle place. And this is the same truth we've been tracing all morning. The doorframe remembered who it was when the covenant touched it. The ember remembers whose breath revived it. The altar remembers who it was when the fire is tended. The people remember when Malachi called them back. And the disciples remember who they are when Yeshua revealed Elijah had come. Identity is restored in the middle. Covenant is renewed in the middle. Revelation comes in the middle, but everything is not when everything is clear, but when everything is confusing. And just as the breath revived the bones in Ezekiel's vision, the fire revived the altar in Tzav, the refining flame revived the hearts in Malachi, and the revelation of Elijah revives the disciples' understanding of who they are and where they stand in God's story. This is where the ancient story becomes our story, because most of us don't meet God on mountaintops. Most of us meet him in the middle of exhaustion, in the middle of parenting, in the middle of financial stress, in the middle of waiting for answers, in the middle of spiritual dryness, in the middle of trying to figure out who we are and where we stand. And just like the disciples, we ask, God, where am I in your story? Has your promise already begun? Is renewal already happening, and I just don't see it yet? And Yeshua answers is the same today. Elijah has already come. I have already begun the work. You are already in the middle of renewal. You may not feel the mountaintop. You may not see the whole picture. You may not understand the timeline, but God is already turning hearts. God is already refining. God is already breathing on the embers. God is already preparing the way. God who renews covenants in the middle of Israel's journey is the same God who renews the covenant in the middle of yours. Dayenu, it would have been enough, and yet God keeps giving us more. This is woven through all this, and woven through all of this is the Spirit of Dayenu. It would have been enough. This is one of my favorite Passover songs. And honestly, I listen to it year-round because Dayenu isn't just a melody, it's a worldview. It's a way of seeing God. It's a way of remembering who we serve. It's remembering that we serve an awesome God who does more than just enough. Our ancestors sang Dayenu because they recognized that every act of God's mercy was a miracle in itself. If he had only brought us out of Egypt, Dayenu. If he had only split the sea, Dayenu. If he had only given us manna, Dayenu. And yet, God keeps giving us more. Freedom, covenant, presence, breath, and life. The refining fire, my bad. And it came, and when I look back over my own life, I see so many moments where I can say, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If God had only done that, if he had only carried me through that season, if he had only answered that prayer, if he had only opened that door, Dayenu. And yet, he keeps going, he keeps giving, he keeps renewing, and he keeps breathing. So as we enter this Passover season, I would invite you to ask yourself, where in your life can you say, Dayenu, it would have been enough? Where God has already shown his faithfulness. He has already carried you. Where he has breathed life into something that felt like it was fading. Because Dayenu is a heartbeat of gratitude and prepares us to see the renewal in the middle, even in the middle of journey. When you gather all these moments together, the ancient doorframe marked with blood, the ember revived by breath, the bones rising in the valley, and the Messiah's renewing of the covenant at the Passover table, it all points to one truth, a truth we need in the season even more than ever. Even dry bones can live again in us, in our homes, and in our communities. Because the covenant is renewed, because the breath of God is moving, because the blood still marks us, because the Spirit still revives us, because Messiah still leads us. This is not just a hopeful idea. It's a pattern of God. It's a story of Israel. It is the promise of covenant. It is the heartbeat of Passover. Whenever you feel worn down, God can breathe in you again. Whenever you feel scattered, God can gather you again. Whenever you feel thin, tired, and unsure, God restores you yet again. Whether you feel like dry bones, God can raise you again. This is the hope of the season. This is the promise of covenant. This is the gift of the Messiah. From freedom to formation, one day at a time, as the Passover will draw to a close, we'll step into another sacred rhythm, the counting of the Omer. If Passover is a moment of freedom, the Omer is a journey of formation. Passover breaks chains, yet the Omer shapes the heart. Passover opens doors. The Omer teaches us how to walk through it. This is not a new idea. It's woven through Scripture itself. You shall count for yourself 7 complete weeks. Leviticus 23:15. The Torah commands us to count, not to rush. to move slowly, intentionally, day by day. Let freedom mature into identity. The Mishna, Marchot 10:3, teaches us the Omer offering was brought from the first barley, the earliest, roughest grain, a symbol that God began his work with what is still unfinished. The Omer is God saying, let me shape you from where you are, not from where you think you should be. In this story, we see that we've been telling the ember inside the home has been just revived by breath. It's no longer a faint glowing under the ash. It's alive again. But an ember doesn't become a flame in a single moment. It grows day by day, breath by breath, with steady tending. And that is what the Omer is. 49 days of tending the ember God has rekindled within us. The same is true with the bones of Ezekiel's vision. They did not just rise, they stood. They became a vast army, formed and strengthened by the breath of God. What began as scattered bones became a people again, ready to walk in covenantal identity. The Passover frees us. The Omer forms us. The ember becomes a flame over 49 days. The bones become a standing army. We become a covenantal people again. And the sages understood this. In the Talmud, Pesachim 6b teaches that Israel did not receive the Torah immediately after leaving Egypt, because freedom without formation cannot last. The Omer is the bridge between redemption and revelation. This season invites us to walk slowly, intentionally, and allowing God to shape what he has revived, and to let the breath that has awakened us continue and to strengthen us, to let the covenant renewed at Passover become the identity we live out each day. And this is where the Omer becomes deeply personal, because the Omer is not just a ritual. It's a practice of noticing, a practice of gratitude, a practice of formation. It is God saying, let me grow this ember inside of you. Let me strengthen what I've revived. Let me shape your heart one day at a time. So as we prepare to count the Omer in just a little over a week and a half, I want to invite you to ask, what is the ember that God has rekindled you this Passover? What part of your heart is God forming in this season? What needs slow, steady tending over the next 49 days? What breath of God do you need to receive again and again? The journey from redemption to revelation is not rushed. It is counting one day at a time, one breath at a time, one step closer to the fullness of God who is calling us. As we step from preparing from Passover into the counting of Omer, the story we've walked through today leaves us with one unmistakable truth. God meets his people in the middle, and he renews them. He met Israel in the middle of slavery, and they marked their door frames with covenant. He met the priest in the middle of their service and kept the altar fire burning. He met the ember burning under the ash, and breath breathed life into it. He met the bones scattered in the valley and raised them into a people again. He met Israel in Malachi's day with refining fire and the turning of hearts. He met the disciples on the mountain path, revealing Elijah had already come. He meets us in Dayenu, reminding us that every mercy would have been enough, and yet he keeps giving us more. And he will meet us in the counting of the Omer, inviting us to let him shape what he has revived. This is the pattern of God. This is the rhythm of redemption. This is the hope of the season. So as you walk into the days ahead, hold on to this. Nothing in your life is too scattered, too tired, too thin, or too far gone for the God of Passover to breathe in again. The same God who freed you is the God who forms you. The same God who revived the ember is the God who strengthens the flame. The same God who raises the bones is the God who restores identity. The same God who began the story is the God who will finish it. And as we start to count the Omer day by day, breath by breath, may you discover the renewal that is already happening right here, right now, in the middle of your journey. Shalom, Shabbat.